When Nathan Armstrong pulled that pistol from his holster, his hand trembling and face flushed crimson, I thought to myself, this guy has no idea what he's just done. My wife Claire just smirked slightly. 10 years in Army intelligence, 5 deployments to the most dangerous corners of the world. And now she was facing down a power-hungry wannabe dictator threatening to shoot her over a blue mailbox. That was the moment I realized our only choice was to let Claire do what she does best, neutralize threats. And as it turned out, this was just the beginning of a war with the corrupt establishment that we never asked for. We moved to Evergreen Estates 3 months ago when I landed a cybersecurity position in Boston. The neighborhood seemed perfect, quiet streets, a community park, and just 30 minutes from Fort Devens where Claire was stationed. The realtor mentioned an active HOA, but we weren't concerned. We'd dealt with homeowners associations before, just basic rules about lawn maintenance and exterior appearances. Our new house had everything we wanted until we met Nathan Armstrong the day after moving in. I was unloading boxes when a shadow fell across the driveway. I turned to find a stocky man in his 60s wearing pressed khakis and a polo shirt with Evergreen Estates HOA embroidered on the chest. What caught my eye immediately was the unmistakable bulge of a holstered handgun at his waist. "Alex Patterson?" he asked with the authoritative tone of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Nathan Armstrong, president of the Evergreen Estates HOA. Here's your copy of our covenant conditions." He thrust a 3-ring binder toward me that was at least 2 inches thick. "Read it thoroughly. We take regulations very seriously here." When Claire emerged from the house, Nathan's demeanor shifted. "Mrs. Patterson, I presume?" "Nathan Armstrong, former law enforcement. I'm Evergreen's very own security force." He chuckled without warmth. Claire smiled politely, though I recognized the calculated assessment in her eyes as she sized him up. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Armstrong," she said. "It's Officer Armstrong to most folks around here," he corrected, patting his gun. 25 years on the force before retirement. That evening, Claire mentioned something seemed off about him. His stance doesn't match his claim of being serious law enforcement, and the way he wears that gun, poor positioning. I bet he was a desk jockey who never drew his weapon outside a qualification range. Little did we know how accurate her assessment was or how quickly Nathan would escalate from annoying HOA president to genuine threat. We spent the next 2 weeks settling in, painting walls, arranging furniture, and making the house our own. The last major project was the mailbox. The existing one was rusted and dented, and Claire had her heart set on a bright blue replacement. "It'll look great against the white picket fence," she said as we browsed options at the hardware store. I knew better than to argue with my wife about home decor. When you're married to someone who can decrypt encrypted enemy communications in under a minute while under fire, you learn to pick your battles. So that Saturday we spent the day installing and painting a vibrant sapphire blue mailbox. It looked fantastic, a bold statement against the neutral tones of the street. We had no idea that this simple color choice would trigger the HOA equivalent of World War III. When the doorbell rang at 6 a.m. the next morning, that's when hell started to open its doors. The insistent ringing had me stumbling down the stairs in my pajamas, mentally cursing whoever thought this was an appropriate time for a house call. I wrenched open the door to find Nathan Armstrong standing on our porch, back ramrod straight in what appeared to be a homemade uniform. He wore tan tactical pants, a shirt with epaulets and that same Evergreen Estates HOA logo, and an actual badge pinned to his chest that read HOA Security. The gun at his hip was now in a more prominent position, displayed in an open carry holster. Behind him stood a thin woman in her 50s, clutching a notepad, her eyes darting nervously between Nathan and me. "Mr. Patterson, your household is in direct violation of Evergreen Estates Covenant Section 12, Paragraph 7. All mailboxes must conform to the approved earth tone palette," Nathan announced, handing me an official-looking violation notice. "This abomination, he gestured to our newly painted blue mailbox, "must be returned to an approved color within 24 hours or you'll face a $500 fine with additional penalties accruing daily." I was still processing this ridiculous demand when I heard Claire coming down the stairs. She had just returned from a night training exercise about 2 hours earlier and had barely gotten to sleep. She was still in her combat uniform pants and a tan t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. Nathan's eyes widened slightly at her appearance, but he quickly recovered his authoritative posture. "Ma'am, I don't know what kind of neighborhood you lived in before, but in Evergreen Estates, we maintain certain standards. Military cosplay doesn't exempt you from following the rules." If he was trying to provoke Claire, he couldn't have chosen a worse approach. My wife's expression didn't change, but I saw the dangerous stillness come over her. The same focused calm I'd witnessed when she'd dealt with aggressive drunks at bars, or that one time a mugger had tried to rob us in Chicago. She was fully awake now, assessing the situation with the clinical precision that made her exceptional at her job. "Mr. Armstrong, I'll need to see the specific regulation regarding approved mailbox colors," Claire said, her voice perfectly measured. Nathan smirked and tapped the massive binder I'd left on the entryway table. "It's all in there. Section 12, Paragraph 7. Perhaps if you'd taken the time to read it before making unauthorized modifications." Claire already had the binder open, flipping to the relevant section with efficiency. She scanned the text, then looked up with a slight smile. "Actually, this paragraph states that exterior elements must maintain harmony with the natural environment and not cause undue visual disruption. There's no specific prohibition against blue, just a guideline about maintaining neighborhood aesthetics." Nathan's face flushed darker. "The approved color palette is on page 138, and there's no blue on it." Claire calmly turned to that page, too. "This palette is listed as recommended colors, not required ones. And the introduction to this section clearly states, these are guidelines unless specifically noted as requirements. The word must doesn't appear anywhere on this page." Nathan's jaw tightened as the woman behind him, whose name tag identified her as Margaret Reynolds, HOA secretary, frantically flipped through her own copy of the regulations. "Mr. Armstrong," she whispered. "She's technically correct about the wording." Nathan silenced her with a glare before turning back to us. "Listen here," he growled, taking a step forward and resting his hand deliberately on his holstered gun. "I don't care what technicalities you think you found. In Evergreen Estates, I'm the law. That mailbox gets repainted by tomorrow, or there will be consequences. You're not actually thinking of fighting this, are you?" I asked Claire afterward. "It's just a mailbox. We could repaint it and be done with this." Claire looked up with determination. "Alex, that man just put his hand on a weapon while making a threat over paint. That's not just being picky. That's someone dangerous with a god complex. If we give in now, he'll walk all over us." That afternoon, our neighbor Tom Garcia stopped by. "I saw Armstrong here this morning," he said. "That blue mailbox thing, it's about control, not color. Nathan does this with every new resident to establish dominance." Tom had fought Nathan over a garden gnome that was supposedly 2 inches taller than regulations allowed. He made my life hell for months with surprise inspections and bogus violations. I had to get a lawyer. Before leaving, Tom showed us video he'd recorded of Nathan with his hand on his gun during our confrontation, just in case things escalate, which they probably will. When Nathan returned the next day, and again rested his hand on his weapon while demanding we repaint, I saw something change in Claire's eyes. It wasn't fear. It was cold calculation. Those familiar with military intelligence would recognize that look. She was assessing a threat. Nathan had just landed himself on an intelligence officer's radar, and Claire had decided it was time to teach the HOA tyrant a lesson. After Nathan's second visit, Claire went into what I privately called her operational mode. This was the focused, methodical side of her that emerged when she was planning missions or solving complex intelligence problems. She started by digging into Nathan Armstrong's background, leveraging resources that most civilians don't have access to. She called in a few favors from friends in military intelligence and spent hours on her laptop, occasionally making notes in a small black notebook she usually reserved for mission details. 3 days later, she laid out her findings while we ate dinner. Nathan Armstrong, aged 65, was never actually a real police officer, at least not the way he implies, she explained between bites of pasta. He worked as a part-time building security guard in a small town in Ohio for about 8 years. Basically, he checked IDs at a government building. Then he moved to Massachusetts and got a job as a security guard at a shopping mall where he was eventually fired for excessive force against a teenage skateboarder. Claire continued her briefing, a habit from her military career. He moved to Evergreen Estates 12 years ago and immediately got involved with the HOA. Within 2 years, he'd maneuvered his way into the presidency through some questionable voting procedures where half the residents mysteriously didn't receive ballots. He's been president ever since, running unopposed for the last 5 election cycles. She flipped a page in her notebook. Here's the interesting part. He's modified the HOA covenant at least 16 times in the past decade, each time giving the president more enforcement power. The latest amendment allows him to inspect properties without prior notice and impose emergency fines for serious violations. And according to state records, none of these amendments were properly filed or voted on as required by Massachusetts law for HOAs. I whistled low. So, he's basically been running a dictatorship and making up rules as he goes. Claire nodded grimly. And charging everyone for the privilege. The HOA fees here are almost double the average for similar communities in this county. I checked the financial statements. There's over $250,000 in the treasury, but the spending records are suspiciously vague. Our investigation took an unexpected turn when Claire received an email from Sophia Wu, an attorney living 3 streets over. I heard you're having trouble with Armstrong. I've been documenting his HOA violations for 3 years. Want to compare notes? In her home office, Sophia showed us a file cabinet dedicated to Nathan's reign of terror. He's targeted at least 23 homeowners in 2 years, she explained, pointing to a neighborhood map with red pins. He focuses on new residents and anyone questioning his authority. Has no one collectively stood up to him? Claire asked. Sophia explained that George Thompson, a retired attorney, had organized an election to remove Nathan. The night before, George's car was vandalized and graffiti spray painted on his garage. Nathan investigated and blamed random vandals, but the timing was suspicious. The election had record low turnout, and Nathan won again. I noticed surveillance cameras in Sophia's home. Installed them after my garden was destroyed when I represented someone fighting Nathan's fines, she explained, handing Claire a flash drive with financial records and improperly modified HOA documents. I haven't had enough for legal action yet, but with more witnesses. Over the next week, Nathan escalated his campaign against us. We received violation notices for everything from grass exceeding height limits by 0.5 inches to improper garbage bin placement. Apparently it was 3 inches too far from the curb. Each notice came with a fine, and each time Nathan delivered it personally, always with his hand resting on his holstered gun. Claire documented every interaction, setting up our own subtle security cameras to capture his increasingly aggressive behavior. One evening, Claire noticed something reflecting sunlight from the large maple tree across from our house. Using her tactical binoculars, she confirmed what we both suspected: Nathan had installed a surveillance camera aimed directly at our property. "That's definitely illegal," she murmured, snapping photos for evidence. No HOA has the authority to surveil individual homes without consent, especially not in Massachusetts with its privacy laws. She picked up her phone and sent a text to Sophia attaching the photos. 10 minutes later, Sophia replied, "This is exactly what we need." Clear violation of state privacy laws. Let me start drafting the cease and desist. Looking at the surveillance camera pointed at our house from the maple tree across the street, Claire just smiled. He wants to play surveillance games? Fine. Let's see who's better at it. She picked up her phone and called someone. Hi, Sophia. I think we need to talk about privacy laws and illegal surveillance in Massachusetts. Yes, we've got clear evidence now. And at that moment, I realized my wife wasn't just defending herself. She was preparing for a comprehensive counteroffensive. 3 days after discovering Nathan's illegal surveillance, Claire implemented the next phase of what she was now openly calling Operation HOA Takedown. She'd taken a rare day off from base to ensure everything went perfectly. That morning she deliberately installed a small American flag on our mailbox, a direct violation of Section 15, Paragraph 9 of Nathan's Precious Covenant, which specified that flags could only be displayed on approved flagpoles or brackets. It was exactly the kind of arbitrary, unenforceable rule that Nathan lived to enforce. Then she waited. She didn't have to wait long. At precisely 10:17 a.m., Nathan's black SUV with a custom HOA 1 license plate pulled up in front of our house. This time, he had 2 people with him, Margaret Reynolds clutching her ever-present clipboard and a stocky man I didn't recognize who stood slightly behind them with his arms crossed, trying to look intimidating. Claire met them at the sidewalk, dressed in her full army uniform. She'd just returned from a training exercise with her unit and hadn't changed. At least that's what Nathan would assume. In reality, she deliberately timed her appearance to coincide with his inevitable inspection. "Good morning, Mr. Armstrong," she said pleasantly. "What brings you by today?" Nathan's face was already flushed with righteous indignation as he thrust a violation notice toward her. "This display is in direct violation of community standards. Unauthorized flag placement is expressly forbidden. That's a $750 fine and you'll need to remove it immediately in the correct pattern." Claire made a show of examining the notice before responding. "Interesting. And you're sure this regulation is legally enforceable under Massachusetts state law? Because my understanding is that the Freedom to Display the American Flag Act of 2005 is a federal law that prohibits HOAs from restricting the display of the American flag." Nathan's flush deepened. "I don't need federal law. The HOA agreement you signed gives me full authority to enforce community standards as I see fit." He was getting louder, more agitated, exactly as Claire had predicted. She maintained her calm, professional demeanor. "Mr. Armstrong, I have been reviewing Massachusetts General Laws Chapter 183A, which governs homeowners associations. It's quite specific about what can and cannot be enforced, as well as proper procedures for notices, hearings, and the homeowner's right to dispute. I'd be happy to discuss these regulations further if you'd like to come inside." The mention of actual laws seemed to further inflame Nathan. "Don't you try to lecture me about laws. I was enforcing laws while you were still in diapers," he shouted, face now approaching purple. That's when circumstances took an unexpected turn in our favor. A government-issued black Suburban pulled into our driveway and a tall woman in a military uniform similar to Claire's stepped out. "Captain Patterson, sorry I'm early," she called out. "Colonel Hayes moved up the briefing, so I thought I'd swing by now instead of after lunch." Claire turned and smiled at the newcomer. "Perfect timing, Lieutenant Rodriguez. I was just discussing some local regulations with our HOA president." She gestured toward Nathan, whose expression had suddenly shifted from anger to uncertainty. Lieutenant Rodriguez approached our little group, her bearing unmistakably military, as she nodded professionally to Nathan and his companions. "Ma'am, hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Nathan seemed momentarily at a loss for words, his eyes darting between Claire and Lieutenant Rodriguez as the realization slowly dawned that Claire's uniform wasn't some kind of military cosplay, as he'd previously suggested. "You're actually in the military," he finally managed. Claire nodded, her expression neutral. "Yes, sir. 10 years of active duty, currently assigned to Fort Devens. As I was saying about those federal flag display laws. Nathan cut her off, visibly recalibrating his approach. Well, I respect our armed forces, of course. But regulations are regulations, Captain. Military or not, everyone in Evergreen Estates follows the same rules. He regained some of his previous bluster, hand moving to rest on his holstered gun, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by Lieutenant Rodriguez, whose relaxed posture subtly shifted to alert. "Is there a problem here, Captain Patterson?" she asked, her tone still professional but with an edge that hadn't been there before. Claire maintained her composure. "Mr. Armstrong was just expressing his concerns about our flag display and reminding me of his authority by gesturing to his firearm." The way she phrased it hung in the air, making Nathan's hand-on-gun posture suddenly seem inappropriate and threatening in the presence of actual military personnel. He quickly moved his hand away from the weapon. That's not what I was doing," he stammered. Lieutenant Rodriguez's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Sir, were you just threatening a United States Army officer with a firearm over an American flag display?" The question was delivered calmly but with the kind of authority that made Nathan take an involuntary step backward. "No, of course not. It's just a habit from my law enforcement days." Claire smiled slightly. "Nathan is a former mall security officer who now heads our HOA. He's very dedicated to his role." Her emphasis on mall security made Nathan wince. At this point, Margaret Reynolds tugged urgently at Nathan's sleeve. "Nathan, we should probably continue this discussion another time," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear. Nathan nodded stiffly, clearly eager for an exit strategy. "Yes, well, I'll leave the violation notice with you, Captain. We can discuss payment terms later." He turned to leave, then paused. "And I expect that flag removed by end of day." As they retreated to Nathan's SUV, Lieutenant Rodriguez turned to Claire with raised eyebrows. "That's the HOA terrorist you told us about? The one who's been harassing half the neighborhood?" Claire nodded, watching Nathan drive away. "Yep. Former mall cop who now gets his kicks threatening people with a gun over mailbox colors and flag displays." Rodriguez shook her head in disbelief. "And he just tried to pull that tough guy act with a military intelligence officer. Man has a death wish." She glanced at me and added, "No offense, sir, but your wife is one of the best strategic minds I've ever worked with. That guy has no idea who he just tried to intimidate." The encounter with Lieutenant Rodriguez had clearly shaken Nathan, but Claire knew it wouldn't be enough to stop him. If anything, being embarrassed in front of his HOA minions would only make him more determined to reassert his authority. "He'll be back," she predicted as we watched his SUV disappear around the corner. "And next time, he'll come prepared." As Claire predicted, Nathan's humiliation only fueled his determination to put us in our place. The next day, we received 5 separate violation notices. Each more ridiculous than the last. Apparently, our garden hose was improperly coiled, $500 fine. Our doormat was 0.75 inches too wide, $750 fine. And our porch light was 5 watts brighter than regulation allowed, $1,000 fine. The total came to over $3,000 in fines with a note that failure to pay within 48 hours would result in liens being placed against our property. But something unexpected happened that evening. Our doorbell rang around 7 p.m., and I opened it to find a middle-aged woman standing on our porch, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "I'm Rebecca Armstrong," she said in a hushed voice. "Nathan's wife. May I come in for a moment? I don't want anyone to see me here." We invited her in, and Claire offered her tea as she perched anxiously on the edge of our sofa. "I'm sorry about Nathan," she began, hands fidgeting with her teacup. "He wasn't always like this. When we first moved here, he was just enthusiastic about the neighborhood, but over the years, it's become an obsession." She explained that Nathan had been deeply affected by his dismissal from the security guard position. He felt humiliated, powerless. The HOA presidency gave him back that sense of control he lost. But lately, he's been getting worse, more paranoid, more aggressive. Rebecca lowered her voice even further. After what happened yesterday with that military officer, he was up all night researching both of you online. He's convinced you're part of some conspiracy to undermine him. He's called emergency meetings with his inner circle on the HOA board. They're plotting something, but they won't tell me what. As Rebecca was leaving, she pressed a USB drive into Claire's hand. These are copies of the real HOA financial records, not the ones he shows at meetings, and recordings of some of his planning sessions. I'm afraid he's going to do something extreme, and I can't stand by anymore. She looked at us pleadingly. Just please don't tell him it came from me. He's not a violent man. Not really. But when he feels cornered. She didn't need to finish the sentence. After Rebecca left, Claire immediately plugged the USB drive into her laptop. What we found was shocking, even after everything we'd already discovered. The financial records showed that Nathan had been skimming money from the HOA funds for years. Small amounts from each homeowner's dues, adding up to thousands of dollars annually. He'd created fake landscaping and maintenance companies that billed the HOA for services never performed, with payments going to accounts he controlled. The audio recordings were even more damning. In meetings with his inner circle, which included Margaret Reynolds and 3 other board members, Nathan openly discussed how to make examples of homeowners who challenged him. In one particularly disturbing recording from just that morning, Nathan could be heard saying, "These military types think they're above the rules. We need to show everyone what happens when people defy the HOA. I'm thinking we go beyond fines. Maybe an accident happens to their property. Nothing traceable, of course." A woman's voice, presumably Margaret's, suggested targeting my car's brake lines, making it sound like concern, "But Nathan, that could be dangerous." Nathan's response sent chills down my spine. Sometimes people need to learn lessons the hard way. Besides, it would just be a small leak. Educational, not fatal. Claire's expression remained neutral as we listened, but I knew that cold look in her eyes. Nathan had just crossed a line from annoying HOA dictator to genuine threat. "Time to accelerate the timeline," she said, pulling out her phone to call Sophia. "We're no longer just dealing with harassment. He's plotting actual property damage, possibly endangering lives." Within hours, Claire had assembled what she jokingly called her civilian task force in our living room: Sophia Wu, the attorney; Tom Garcia, our neighbor who'd been documenting Nathan's behavior; George Thompson, the retired attorney; and 3 other homeowners who'd been particularly targeted by Nathan's regime. "Based on what we've just learned, we need to move quickly," Claire explained, laying out printed copies of the financial records and transcripts of the recordings. "Nathan is escalating, and he's desperate. That makes him dangerous." George Thompson, a distinguished man in his 70s with a shock of white hair, studied the financial documents with a practiced eye. "This is textbook embezzlement. With these records, we could have him arrested tomorrow." Sophia shook her head. "But we need more than just the recordings and files. Rebecca could claim they were fabricated, and it would be her word against ours. We need to catch him in the act doing something that can't be explained away." That's when Claire outlined her plan, what she called Operation Liberty Estates. It was a comprehensive strategy that utilized everyone's skills and resources. Tom would expand his surveillance network to document Nathan's movements around the neighborhood. Sophia would prepare legal documents for an emergency injunction based on the evidence we already had. George would use his legal connections to ensure our complaints were taken seriously by local authorities. And Claire? Claire would set the perfect trap. "Nathan's weakness is his ego and his need for control," she explained. We're going to create a situation where he'll be so desperate to reassert his authority that he'll overstep in ways that can't be ignored legally or morally. The plan required perfect timing and coordination. But as Claire reminded everyone, this is basically a condensed version of operations I've run in much more hostile environments. Trust me, Nathan Armstrong has no idea who he's messing with. As our new allies departed with their assignments, I asked Claire if she was sure this was the right approach. We could just pay the fines, repaint the mailbox, and keep our heads down until my contract is up next year, I suggested. Claire looked at me with a mix of determination and principle that reminded me why I fell in love with her in the first place. Alex, this isn't just about us anymore. Nathan's targeting vulnerable people in this community, retirees on fixed incomes, single parents, people without the resources or knowledge to fight back. Someone needs to stand up to bullies like him. And standing up to bullies happens to be in my job description. She glanced at the neighborhood map Sophia had marked with all of Nathan's victims. Besides, from a tactical perspective, we've now got something Nathan doesn't have, a united community. And that's how you win any conflict, whether it's overseas or right here in suburbia. Claire implemented her plan the next morning. While Nathan was at his weekly HOA meeting at Evergreen Estates Clubhouse, Claire and I created a massive American flag design across our front lawn using washable paint. This deliberately violated Section 7, Paragraph 18, lawns must be uniform in color, no patterns or designs permitted. Word spread quickly, and neighbors started stopping by to see our display and share their own Armstrong horror stories. Around 1 p.m., Tom texted, "Eagle is leaving the nest. ETA 5 minutes." Nathan was on his way. Claire positioned everyone strategically. Sophia and George observed from a parked car across the street. Tom activated cameras on several neighbors' properties. I stood on the porch recording with my phone. Claire took her place in the center of our lawn flag in full army uniform, standing at parade rest. Her commanding officer had approved her wearing the uniform and arranged for Lieutenant Rodriguez and 2 unit members to happen by, if needed. Nathan screeched to a halt in front of our house at 1:08 p.m., exploding from his SUV with Margaret Reynolds and the stocky man from before trailing behind him. "What the hell is this?" Nathan bellowed, hand already resting on his gun. Claire remained composed. "Good afternoon, Mr. Armstrong. I see you've noticed our patriotic display for Memorial Day." Nathan was furious. "This violates the covenant." Claire calmly corrected him. "This is our private property, and the paint is temporary. Section 9, Paragraph 5 explicitly states that patriotic displays for national holidays are permitted. Memorial Day is within the 10-day window allowed for holiday displays." Backed into a corner by his own rules. Nathan made the critical mistake Claire anticipated. He unholstered his gun and held it at his side. "I've had enough of your rule twisting. This ends now. Remove this desecration immediately, or I'll remove you from this neighborhood permanently." In the split second after Nathan drew his weapon, several things happened simultaneously. Tom signaled from across the street, confirming all cameras were recording. Sophia began quietly calling the police. And Claire. Claire didn't flinch, didn't step back, didn't show a hint of fear. Instead, she locked eyes with Nathan and spoke in a voice loud enough to be captured by every recording device in the vicinity. "Mr. Armstrong, you are now threatening a United States Army officer with a deadly weapon on private property. I'm going to give you one chance to holster that gun and step back, or I will be forced to defend myself." Nathan, caught up in his power play, didn't register the arrival of the black Suburban that pulled up behind him. Lieutenant Rodriguez and 2 other uniformed soldiers emerged, taking in the scene with professional alertness. "Captain Patterson," Rodriguez called out, her voice deliberately casual but her posture combat-ready. "Is there a problem here?" Nathan spun around, startled by the new voices, his gun still in hand, now inadvertently pointed in the general direction of 3 Army personnel. "Drop the weapon now," Rodriguez's command voice echoed down the street as all three soldiers moved into defensive positions. Nathan, suddenly realizing the severity of his situation, fumbled to holster his gun, nearly dropping it in the process. I'm authorized to carry this," he stammered. Lieutenant Rodriguez approached carefully, her training evident in every controlled movement. "Sir, having a permit to carry doesn't authorize you to draw and aim at people over lawn decorations." She positioned herself between Nathan and Claire. "Captain Patterson, as your superior officer, I'm ordering you to file a full report on this incident. And sir," she turned back to Nathan, "I strongly suggest you leave these premises immediately before local law enforcement arrives. They tend to take a dim view of civilians threatening military personnel with firearms." Nathan's face had gone from crimson to ashen. His hand trembled as he secured his weapon, and he took several unsteady steps backward. Margaret Reynolds was already retreating to the SUV, wanting no part of what had just transpired. "This isn't over," Nathan hissed. But the threat sounded hollow even to his own ears. As if on cue, police sirens approached. "Actually, Mr. Armstrong," Claire replied calmly. "I think it is." By the time Nathan fled, 3 police cruisers were pulling up. The next few hours involved statements, evidence collection, and witness testimonies. The officers were skeptical until they saw video evidence from multiple angles showing Nathan drawing his weapon. "We'll need all copies of this footage," the lead officer said. "This is serious, brandishing a weapon, making threats, potentially a hate crime against military personnel." Sophia presented our documented evidence of Nathan's harassment pattern, financial improprieties, and recorded conversations discussing property damage. "I believe you'll find this relevant to your investigation." By nightfall, the story had spread throughout the neighborhood. Neighbors stopped by to share support and their own Armstrong horror stories. George Thompson arrived with champagne. "They're executing a search warrant on Nathan's house and the HOA office right now. They found some very interesting financial records." Tom raised his glass to Operation Liberty Estates and to the best strategist our neighborhood has ever seen. Claire accepted the praise modestly. "Just doing what needed to be done, no different than any other mission. Identify the threat, gather intelligence, develop a strategy, and execute with precision." The next morning, Nathan was released on bail, his connections proving real. Though police confiscated his weapon and issued a restraining order, he wasn't neutralized. "We've won the battle, but not the war," Claire noted. Soon, strange things began happening. Tom's tires were slashed. Sophia's client appointments were mysteriously cancelled, and someone attempted to access Claire's military personnel file using stolen credentials. "He's using his network," Claire concluded during an emergency meeting. "Nathan has people with access and resources working for him." The breakthrough came when Rebecca Armstrong appeared at our door looking terrified. "Nathan's been making calls non-stop," she whispered. "He has friends at the sheriff's department and mayor's office, and he's been talking daily with Senator Williams. They're planning to discredit you all before the court case." This explained everything. Senator Williams was notorious for corruption and taking bribes from developers. Claire immediately recognized the implications. "This isn't about mailbox colors," she said after Rebecca left. "Follow the money. Evergreen Estates has value we're not seeing." Sophia and George discovered that Evergreen Estates sat on land being considered for highway expansion and had valuable mineral rights due to natural gas discoveries nearby. "The HOA controls collective negotiating rights for any community-wide land deals," Sophia explained. "Whoever controls the HOA controls whether this land gets sold and for how much," George added. "And Senator Williams approves highway funding through the Transportation Committee. If Nathan is working for him, they could be orchestrating a land grab worth millions." Soon, unknown cars began parking near our house. Our mail arrived opened. Someone even tried using a forged ID to enter Fort Devens, asking about Claire's unit. "We're being watched," Claire acknowledged. "But two can play that game." She called some former colleagues, and the next day, 3 nondescript individuals arrived carrying duffel bags, moving with the same alertness as Claire. Within hours, they established a counter-surveillance operation with hidden cameras and signal interceptors and began tracing connections between Nathan, Senator Williams, and their network of officials. "This is now a counterintelligence operation," Claire explained. Nathan thought this was a simple HOA dispute. He had no idea he was fighting someone trained to dismantle enemy networks. Meanwhile, I contributed the best way I knew how, through technology. As a cybersecurity specialist, I developed systems for tracking complex data relationships. Now I applied those skills to mapping Nathan's network. Every connection, every financial transaction, every communication we could document went into my database. Patterns emerged. Shell companies that connected to Senator Williams but were managed by Nathan's brother-in-law. Property transactions throughout the county that followed a similar pattern to what was happening in Evergreen Estates. Mysterious withdrawals from the HOA fund that coincided with key votes on the Transportation Committee. "This isn't just corruption," Sophia concluded as we reviewed my findings. "This is organized crime with a suburban facade." The breakthrough came when one of Claire's friends successfully cloned the phone of Detective Morris, Nathan's contact at the sheriff's department. The text messages revealed an explicit conspiracy. "Need dirt on the military woman. Son says find anything, drugs, affairs, mental health issues. Needs her discredited before the hearing." Another message outlined plans to plant evidence in our home during a fraudulent wellness check scheduled for the following day. "That's it," Claire decided. "We're not waiting for them to move against us. Time to spring the trap." She gathered our coalition and outlined the final phase of Operation Liberty Estates. Everyone had a role to play. Timing was critical. As Claire reminded us, in special operations, we have a saying, "Slow is smooth and smooth is fast." We're going to move deliberately and catch them in the act. The morning of the planned wellness check arrived, and our house was prepared. Claire's team had installed hidden cameras throughout the property, capturing every angle. Sophia had prepared legal documents and contacted trusted law enforcement officials who weren't in Nathan's pocket. George had reached out to a judge for emergency warrants once evidence was collected. And I had set up a secure cloud server where all surveillance footage would be instantly uploaded, ensuring that even if our equipment was discovered or destroyed, the evidence would persist. Claire and I made a show of leaving the house together around 10 a.m., making sure we were spotted by the unmarked car that had been surveilling us. In reality, we drove around the block and re-entered through a neighbor's connecting backyard, where we joined Claire's team in a hidden observation post set up in our own basement. At precisely 11:17 a.m., Detective Morris arrived with 2 uniformed deputies. They approached our front door and knocked perfunctorily before Morris used a master key, obtained illegally we later learned, to enter our home. "Police, wellness check," he called out, but their subsequent actions revealed their true purpose. The deputies began systematically searching our house while Morris directed them to specific locations. "Check the master bedroom nightstand," he instructed, "and look behind the toilet tank in the main bathroom." They were clearly searching for predetermined hiding spots, not conducting a legitimate welfare check. When one deputy headed for the kitchen, Morris redirected him. "No time for that. Focus on planting, finding the evidence in the locations I told you about." We watched as Morris removed a small bag and instructed a deputy to plant it in our bedroom drawer. "Make sure it looks hidden," Morris directed. "Senator Williams wants this to stick. Once we file the drug possession report, her military career is over, and their case falls apart." The uncomfortable deputy complied. "This doesn't feel right. These people are military." Morris dismissed his concern. "Heroes or troublemakers? Doesn't matter. Williams needs this subdivision deal. And Armstrong delivers votes. So, we deliver for Armstrong. After they left, Claire contacted Lieutenant Rodriguez, who arrived with military police to document the planted evidence without disturbing fingerprints. Sophia filed emergency motions, and within hours, federal agents arrested Detective Morris. The deputies quickly turned on him, agreeing to testify in exchange for leniency. FBI agents then raided Senator Williams' office and Nathan's home simultaneously. What they uncovered shocked everyone. Nathan was part of a multi-million-dollar land fraud scheme orchestrated by Williams. HOA funds had been drained to finance political campaigns and bribe officials. The arbitrary rules were designed to drive down property values and force out resistant homeowners. They even discovered that evergreen estates had been built with substandard materials through Williams family companies, with falsified environmental reports hiding health risks. The entire community had been a sophisticated con from the beginning. The next morning, the story broke across local and then national news: state senator and HOA president arrested in massive fraud conspiracy. Satellite trucks lined our quiet suburban streets as reporters sought comments from residents. As the most visible victims of Nathan's campaign, Claire and I found ourselves reluctantly thrust into the spotlight. When a reporter asked Claire how she had managed to expose such a complex criminal enterprise, she simply smiled and said, "I just applied the same principles we use in military intelligence: identify vulnerabilities, gather evidence, and execute a precise operation. The only difference is that usually I'm doing it in places a lot more dangerous than a Massachusetts subdivision." In the weeks that followed, Evergreen Estates underwent a remarkable transformation. With Nathan and his inner circle facing multiple federal charges, the community held an emergency election for a new HOA board. George Thompson, the retired attorney, was unanimously elected president with Sophia Wu as legal counsel and Tom Garcia as treasurer. Their first act was to commission a complete audit of the HOA finances and a thorough review of all the arbitrary rules Nathan had implemented over the years. We found over 170 regulations that had never been properly approved by homeowners, George announced at the first general meeting. Everything from the color of your mailbox to how you trim your hedges. None of it was legally enforceable. Today, we're wiping the slate clean and starting over with a simple 10-page document that focuses on what really matters: maintaining our community without infringing on individual rights. The revelation about the substandard construction and environmental concerns initially caused panic, but Claire stepped in with characteristic efficiency. She contacted colleagues at the Army Corps of Engineers who volunteered to conduct comprehensive structural and environmental assessments of every home in Evergreen Estates. When serious issues were discovered in about 25% of the properties, Sophia led a class action lawsuit against Williams Development Companies. The settlement not only funded all necessary repairs but also established a trust for long-term infrastructure maintenance. This neighborhood wasn't just ruled by a tyrant, Sophia explained at the settlement announcement. It was built on lies. Today, we're literally and figuratively rebuilding its foundation. Nathan Armstrong remained defiant even after his arrest, insisting through his attorney that he was the victim of a military coup in his neighborhood. But as evidence mounted and his co-conspirators turned state's witness one by one, his bravado crumbled. Senator Williams, facing decades in prison for corruption and fraud, quickly implicated Nathan in exchange for a reduced sentence. Detective Morris provided detailed accounts of years of evidence tampering and harassment conducted at Nathan's behest, and Margaret Reynolds, the ever-present HOA secretary, turned over meticulously detailed records of every illegal action the HOA had taken under Nathan's direction. Apparently, she'd been documenting everything as an insurance policy all along. 6 months later, Nathan faced 41 charges, including embezzlement, fraud, illegal surveillance, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The most serious, attempting to frame a military officer with false evidence, carried a potential 20-year sentence. When the jury returned a guilty verdict on all counts, Nathan finally broke down as he was led away. The judge sentenced him to 15 years, citing his extraordinary breach of community trust and vindictive targeting of military personnel. Nathan's assets were seized to fund Evergreen Estates restoration, including a community garden built where his house once stood. A year after our confrontation over the patriotic lawn flag, Evergreen Estates celebrated its reconstruction. Homes had been repaired, the community center renovated, and a playground built where Nathan's cameras once surveilled residents. Standing on our porch with our still vibrant blue mailbox, Claire watched children playing freely in yards no longer subject to arbitrary rules. "In all my operations, I've never seen a more complete victory," she said. "Usually, we disrupt a target and move on, never knowing if we made a lasting difference. But here..." She gestured to neighbors chatting freely across property lines, children playing without fear of HOA citations. George Thompson approached our house, carrying a slim binder. "Hot off the presses," he announced proudly. "The new Evergreen Estates Community Guidelines, just 12 pages long." He opened to the first page where a simple mission statement was prominently displayed. "Mutual respect is the only rule we truly need," George chuckled. "We do still have a few necessary regulations about noise levels and safety issues, but nothing about mailbox colors or lawn mowing patterns." A new family was moving in across the street, and George excused himself to deliver their copy of the guidelines. I watched as he greeted them warmly, pointing toward our house as he spoke. The young couple looked over, noticing our blue mailbox, and waved. Claire waved back. "I bet George is telling them the story," she said with a smile. "About how an HOA president pulled a gun on his neighbor, not knowing she was a military intelligence officer." I slipped my arm around her waist. "You know, most people's HOA disputes end with strongly worded letters or maybe a small claims court appearance. Leave it to you to turn it into a federal case that takes down a corrupt state senator." Claire laughed, leaning into me. "What can I say? Go big or go home. Or in this case, go big to protect our home." As we watched the sun setting over our transformed community, Claire's phone buzzed with a text from her commanding officer. She read it and smiled. "Remember how I told you that sometimes we never know if our operations make a lasting difference? Well, apparently the FBI is using our Evergreen Estates case as a training model for investigating public corruption. They're calling it Operation Blue Mailbox." The irony wasn't lost on either of us. What began as a petty dispute over mailbox paint had exposed layers of corruption that might have otherwise remained hidden for years, affecting countless lives. All because a power-hungry HOA president made the critical mistake of pulling a gun on the wrong woman, an elite military intelligence officer who knew exactly how to dismantle threats, whether they came from foreign adversaries or suburban tyrants with delusions of grandeur. And if you're ever driving through Massachusetts and come across a peaceful subdivision with a striking blue mailbox on one particular house, just remember, sometimes the most dangerous person isn't the one with the gun, but the one who knows exactly what to do when someone points it at them.